I'm here today with Kurt Leland, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Otherwhere, a field guide for astral travellers. So thank you for joining me, Kurt. And I wanted to start off with asking you, why the name Otherwhere?
Well, the experiences that I write about, the astral projection experiences, take place in a non-physical reality where time and space function very differently from what we normally experience in physical reality. So I was thinking that time and space are quite other over there, and why not call this Otherwhere? Seemed like a catchy title. I looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary to see whether it really was a word, and it exists, although it hasn't been used very commonly, and the poet W.H. Auden used it in one of his poems, so I felt like I was in good company.
Absolutely. And because you was discussing time and dimensions, I wondered do you discuss the fourth dimension at all in your book?
Not literally. You have these experiences, these inner experiences, and it's hard to relate them to anything outside of the experience itself. And what I tried to do as I developed a long history going back to when I was 15 years old, so now 45 years, is have the experience and just let it sit. And then gradually build a map when I started noticing similarities. And I could see one experience was in some way related to another experience. But I tried not to fit it into any kind of system to begin with. I wanted whatever it was to grow naturally out of the experiences itself. So I didn't use quantum physics, which is a common way that people try to talk about astral projection if they have a scientific mind. I didn't try to use any of the systems that you get, for example, in theosophy about planes and so on. I didn't even know theosophy when I was collecting the material for this book. And gradually over time, you start to get a sense of how these different experiences somehow fit with one another. So I talked about them taking place in zones, because that seemed to be a name that was somehow evocative but didn't commit you to having any relationship between them, higher or lower, or to the north or to the south, and so on. So the interesting thing is that when I first published this book in 2001, completely oblivious to theosophy, I found theosophy about 5 or 6 years later, and then started to see how neatly these experiences fit into the theosophical ideas of bodies and planes. So when I produced this second edition, which is revised and expanded from the first one, I added a few chapters, but I especially provided some notes that help point people in the direction of the theosophical bodies and planes as a suggestion for one way to organize experiences. So the problem is that anytime you've got a system, the system comes with some built-in limitations. So the idea of dimensions, for example. People like to speculate that there are dimensions beyond the three that we're familiar with, but we can't really describe or understand what they are except maybe as mathematical possibilities. And we're somewhat committed to metaphors about points and lines and planes and so on, the way they're built up geometrically. And my experience in the non-physical reality that I go to when I'm astral traveling is, again, beyond space and time. Each level or each plane or subdivision can have less time or less space than the previous one if you're, ascending, so to speak, through the planes. And I didn't want to commit myself to that sort of quasi-mathematical, scientific way of looking at things, because I really don't know how I could map those systems into each other. And what I tried to do in the book is not really very theoretical. It's as experiential as I could make it. I think it's a noble endeavor to try to link it up, any kind of inner experience like this, with quantum physics or something like that, but I don't have the know-how to do it, so I just stuck with what happened when I was there.
So when you was having your experiences, would you go into a trance or into a meditation, or how was your process?
In the beginning, these experiences happened spontaneously. Sometimes during a nap, sometimes when I was falling asleep, sometimes after I had awakened in the morning and then fallen asleep again. And I used those periods to practice. After I eventually learned that those seemed to be the best times, falling asleep, waking up, and having a nap in the middle of the afternoon. But gradually I realized that about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere maybe up to about 4 or 4:30, if I'd gone to bed around 11 o'clock or midnight, that seemed to be the prime time for the most interesting adventures to take place. And I couldn't predict how or when, and I wasn't really interested in trying to make them happen, but I would reap the benefits of the experiences in the morning when I woke up. And I came to believe that I had some kind of travel agency on the other side who was deciding when and where I was going to go, and they had a lot more interesting plans for me than I could come up with on my own. So it's an interesting thing. I've spent time working with people who write about their experiences and their questions in online forums about astral projection. And one of the first questions that often comes up is, can you do this at will? That seems to be some kind of goal for a lot of people. And I could recognize the opportunity, I could take advantage of it, but I often couldn't make it happen on demand. And eventually I gave up because I liked just being taken somewhere when it was time to go. And but the interesting thing is, if I would bring that up among people who asked me questions, I often lost a lot of credibility, because for them, the idea of control is the most important thing. And I just want to put it on record that you end up in a lot more interesting places if somebody else decides where you're going.
So when you were saying you was going with your travel agency, whoever they were, was there like a spiritual guide there for you, or your guide, or you just went off on your own and went wherever they sent you?
Often I didn't know that there was anyone involved. Patterns would develop, and then I would start to realize that I seemed to be in a training program of some kind. And at various points, I did meet up with a couple of beings, a male and a female, who seemed to have a lot more knowledge than the average human being, and certainly a lot more than I had. And as these beings showed up, I really became aware that they were guides and teachers for me. One of them is related to an inner teacher that I channel, whose name I call him Charles. The other one I call Athena, and I only see her in my astral adventures, and I call her Athena because she seems to know everything about me. So they don't really have names over there. You can give them any name that you want. And for a long time, I didn't even recognize that Charles was Charles. I just had this male being who would show up and give me instruction from time to time.
So you was channeling before you got involved in this kind of work?
The channeling developed somewhere in the middle. The first experiences were when I was around 15. They scared me. I didn't have anyone to talk to about them. I didn't have any context for understanding them. I didn't even know if there was someone I could go to ask questions about them. And I learned to shut them down because they were too frightening. I thought I was dying because I was being drawn away from my body. And I didn't realize there were possibilities to explore there. So it wasn't until I was about 20 that I met someone in college, a fellow student, who knew what these experiences were. And he gave me a book to read called Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe, an American. And that opened my eyes and helped me realize these experiences could be interesting to explore. There was nothing to be afraid of. And I should maybe just try it out and see what I could accomplish. So the channeling came not too long after I found the books by Robert Monroe. I had been reading the Seth books by Jane Roberts, and quite a long time before that, my grandfather, who was interested in Edgar Cayce, was giving me books by Edgar Cayce when I was 10. And he so much wanted somebody to talk to about all of this, and I was the only one who was interested. So he gave me books on dreams and reincarnation and Atlantis, and that was really my first introduction to the whole field. Interestingly enough, after he died, he had changed his mind. He came from a very religious family. And as I write in Otherwhere, I met him on the other side, not very long after he died. And he was a high school principal in life when he had a work. And he tried to look as imposing as he possibly could, and he shook his finger at me and he said, "Go back to the Bible."
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
No,
That's quite
no.
funny.
It was funny. It was funny to me. I mean, obviously it was important to him that he not feel that he'd somehow led me astray by having read all of these alternative things, Edgar Cayce and so on. So what I explained to him was, well, here we are talking, right? In the afterlife, right? Who else in the family is doing that, right? I got here to talk to you because of what you got started. I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
Oh, I hope he understood that, and
He
wherever he
did.
is in the spiritual world,
Yeah.
he's moving on.
I told him some things that I had experienced in the afterlife realms myself, and he got all excited and wanted to go find out for himself. So,
Oh, excellent.
and then I didn't see him again for about 10 years until his wife passed. And when she passed, he came into one of my dreams and told me that she was going to be dying soon, and he wanted to make sure that everyone in the family could come to the memorial service so we could have a reunion. It was a tricky thing to arrange because there were so many people making plans. And as it happened, my grandmother died about a month later, and it worked out perfectly for one of my aunts who was between two long trips. She had a period of about 12 days between these two trips where she could have gone to a funeral. And that's exactly what happened. So my grandfather got his wish. Excuse me.
And do you meet any other people that you knew, or is it mainly you're off out to other dimensions that maybe are hard to describe, or are they like this world, or is it different every time?
Different every time probably describes it. I've done a lot of touring of the afterlife, and I've followed a few people through the afterlife. I had an uncle. He died in a particular year, and about 8 years later, I'd visited him 4 or 5 times, and he was about to reincarnate. And I saw him, this is not in Otherwhere, comes in a later book, The Unanswered Question, but I saw him in a future life screening room where he was getting a chance to go over some of the things he would be learning that he hadn't learned in his previous lifetime. And that was an interesting adventure. He was somebody who could never talk about his feelings. And the guide that was talking to him about his future life said, "You're going to have to learn to do that. You have to talk about your feelings." And he said to the guide, "You are without mercy." So apparently that was a very difficult thing for him.
So that reincarnation to you has been proven through doing this kind of work?
Proven is probably not the right word. I believe in it, and I do find that there are arrangements for it in the places that I go to in the afterlife. Proof would be something different. I almost got the street name for where my uncle was planning to be born in Rochester, New York. It's hard to bring things like that back. I wasn't able to. But then I asked myself, if I had gotten it, what was I going to do with that information?
Yes.
You know, knocking on the door and saying someone who probably doesn't understand reincarnation, "Hello, I believe my uncle's been born as your baby." Sounds a little daft.
Yes, it's a bit awkward, isn't it? And then to be, that little child's going to be growing up and then suddenly you appear saying, I think you used to be my uncle. Unless
Yeah.
that child was into that kind of thing or grew into that when he was older.
Exactly. The other part of your question was about other realms or other dimensions, and that's often also the case. The afterlife on the astral level of being is a place that I've written extensively about in Otherwhere. But in theosophy, they also talk about a mental plane, and I've had some visits there too. They came somewhat later than Otherwhere, so they're in the unanswered question. One of them was a location where all the world's operas and plays are like theme parks. You can actually go, there's a whole Shakespeare section, for example. I went to the opera section, and you can actually have the experience of being inside the mindset of any of the characters and seeing the plot from all of those different angles. And it was quite fun to do that. So
I'd like to go there. I'd go and try out Faust.
oh yes, the ones that have been around for a long time that have so many different interpretations and so on. Apparently these areas of the mental plane are constantly growing the more people think about or rehearse or produce or act in or film anything like the Faust legend. And so as a result, there's a very rich possibility of human experience to get from the spiritual perspective. And unfortunately, the neglected books and so on, eventually they don't die out, but people lose their way and they don't get funded with energy, so to speak, like the ones that we call the classics. But even Harry Potter, I'm sure, has a theme park on the other side. I haven't seen it myself, but people have been actively creating it in their imagination for quite some time after the books were published, and the author had, done the initial work, so to speak, to create that realm. That would be an interesting target sometime, to go to the Harry Potter theme park on the mental plane. I'll have to remember that.
Yes, go and get your little wand and your special cape and go and play. I've forgotten the name of the game they play, but that'd be fun. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But then that's probably a lot to do with like what you was just saying, people thinking about it and putting it out there into the ether, so it's developing even more on them. Would they be like astral planes, do you think, these other dimensions that you've just spoken about are? Or like this opera place, would that be an astral realm?
The word astral has a very specific meaning in theosophy, but it is often used in a very loose sort of way in the rest of the culture for anything non-physical. So when I talk about the astral plane, I'm talking about the one that's directly beyond the physical plane and is the first stop on our afterlife journey. And following that, there's a mental plane where we go into a deeper experience. The astral plane is all about emotion and desire. That's that level of our being. And I often call it the astral/emotional plane to remind people of that. You could say the plane beyond that is astral in the sense that it's non-physical, but it's more about ideas, concepts. That's why I was talking about the world, the cultural dynamics. The world's culture will all be found there: music, plays, novels, and so on. People who have had near-death experiences can go to the mental plane and they'll see it as a university, place of great learning. On the astral level, they might, like the famous psychic Sylvia Browne, see the afterlife as a golf course. It's more about the things we wished we could have done and didn't have time to do or couldn't get enough of, that kind of thing.
And I wanted to ask you, from your descriptions in your book, some people would call this out-of-body experiences. Is that what you would relate it to as well, or is that something different?
They're related. So the thing about theosophy that's so interesting to me is that there's more than one body in the theosophical teaching. You've got the physical body, that's obvious. You've got an etheric body, which is related to the physical body, and it's responsible for the life force that animates the physical body. Then you've got the astral body, which is related to the emotional experience that we have on the physical plane, and it's related to our dreams and this phase of the afterlife. And then you've got a mental body, same thing, but next higher level, having to do with the mind and ideas and culture. And then you've got the causal body, which is the body that relates most to the popular culture idea of the soul. It's the part of us that reincarnates, that stores our memories, that has a kind of master plan for our growth in any particular lifetime. And I understand it's called the causal body because it carries the causes, the karmic causes, that we bring with us into a new lifetime. So that's just background to answer your question. Technically speaking, any of these bodies you can use as a vehicle of consciousness, as it's called in theosophy, that'll help you cruise about on the astral plane or the mental plane or what have you. Mostly what people mean when they talk about an out-of-body experience is you leave your physical body in full consciousness and you're in another body, probably one that's also present in the same room, and that body can look back on the one lying on the bed and know that you're in two places at once and that your soul or consciousness is not limited to the physical body. That's a typical out-of-body experience. And then people will also talk about having the experience of separation from the physical body and then traveling on the physical plane, going distant locations. And that would also be an out-of-body experience. But most of the time, and I think this is probably true not just for me, but for most people, if you don't remember or you don't consciously go through the process of separation from the physical body and end up on a different non-physical plane, you're astral projecting. And so the difference is whether you've separated or not. Now in theosophy, each of these bodies is a layer of our aura. So we've got the surface of the physical skin, physical body. Then just a little bit out from there, up to about 9 inches out, is our etheric body. Twice that distance, 18 inches out, that would be our astral body, and so on, ever increasing up to about 5 feet out, which is the limits for most people for the causal body. The thing is, if you can take your consciousness and move it into one of those layers, it's no longer focused in the physical body, but you can use it as a vehicle of consciousness. You can use this body that you're in as a vehicle of consciousness. This is not talked about in most of the books about out-of-body experiences. And even Robert Monroe, who's my great hero, it took him many, many years to realize that you could have an experience of moving into what I call the etheric body, which is not able to move very far away from the physical body, up to, 20 feet maybe. And then you can have the experience of separating from that body and going into another one, which would be, for example, an astral body or the astral body, depending on how far out you've gone in your aura. So all of this is to say that the terms are loosely used, but they could be more specifically applied, and that's one of the things that I'm talking about in Otherwhere, how we can think about these out-of-body and astral projection as similar, related. I would say astral projection is a higher version, so to speak. And anybody who's read the Robert Monroe books will realize that he was talking more about astral projection in the way I'm defining it in his second book, which is called Far Journeys.
And do you have, are you interested in hearing about other people's experiences of this kind of thing? Do you have a forum or anything for people to discuss this kind?
I don't have a forum anymore, but I spent a year on the Astral Dynamics Forum that Robert Bruce, who's another fairly famous astral traveler, has had for many, many years. I believe it still goes on. I was on that forum because I was gathering information about what people were doing, how they were trying to have out-of-body experiences, and what was working and what wasn't working, and especially where they got stuck. And that's what helped me write The Multidimensional Human, which is a kind of sequel to Otherwhere. Otherwhere is more descriptive. But The Multidimensional Human is more about practice. How can you have these experiences yourself?
Oh, okay, because a lot of people did ask me if your book was a guidebook of how to develop yourself, so they would be better off with that book if they wanted.
I'd really like to have them as a pair. Right now it's not very well available, but I was just meeting with my publisher, John Beecher, of White Crow Books this afternoon, and he's urging me to work with him in producing a version of The Multidimensional Human, which always, well, I published it in 2010. It's always just been a print book. People for years have begged me for an ebook version, and I think John will do that, which is quite exciting.
Yes,
Otherwhere is available as an ebook as well as a print book.
Oh, that's good to hear. And if people wanted to know more about your work, you have a website. Would you like to tell us what that is?
Yes, it's my name.com, kurtleland.com, KurtLeland. I am reachable that way, and people do sometimes write to me about their experiences, and if I can, I'll give some pointers, either to texts that might be illuminating or to, my own experience. I might try to help someone understand it as related to one of the bodies or planes. I'm always a little concerned about getting overwhelmed by the amount of email that could come in from something like that. But I do try to answer any email that comes in. It just takes a while.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and good luck with all your books.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you too.